Now that we have noticed how Genesis chapters 4 and 5 convey a pattern of early violence and hope of deliverance, we should turn to the second scenario of violence and hope as it appears in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. When we look more closely at these verses, it becomes apparent that chapter 6, verses 1 through 8 divide into 3 steps. First, verses 1 through 3 concern characters known as the sons of God. Second, verses 4 through 7 focus on other characters known as the Nephilim. Following these 2 steps, Moses added an afterword in verse 8, mentioning Noah once again, the man in whom there was hope of deliverance. The 2 main steps of these verses describe a series of threatening events that took place on earth and then reveal how God reacted to these events. Let's look first at the threat of the sons of God and at God's reaction in chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. Unfortunately, these verses are among the most difficult to interpret in the book of Genesis. The difficulty primarily centers on verse 2, where we read these words. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Moses did not explain precisely who these sons of God and daughters of men were. Apparently, he expected his original readers to understand what he meant. But it has been impossible for modern readers to settle the identities of these characters beyond question. In the history of interpretation, 3 reasonable identifications have been suggested. First, the sons of God may be Sethites who married women descended from Cain. This interpretation has some merit because of the contrast set up between the Cainites and Sethites in chapters 4 and 5 of Genesis. A second option is that the sons of God may be angels, and the daughters of men were mere humans. This view also has some merit because angels are often called sons of God in the Old Testament, in passages like Job chapter 1 verse 6 and Psalm 29 verse 1. A third option is to understand the sons of God as kings or noblemen who took peasant women. This outlook has merit as well because in the ancient Near East, kings were often called sons of God, just as the son of David is called God's son in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 14 and in Psalm 2 verse 7. Although I favor this third interpretation, we should not be dogmatic about any particular position. Now, even though we cannot be sure who these characters were, we can be more certain of what they did. You will recall that in Genesis chapter 6 verse 2, we read that the sons of God married any of the daughters of men they chose. This is not ordinary language in the Old Testament for legitimate marriage, and it strongly suggests that neither the women nor their families consented to these relationships. Rather, the sons of God, who may have been powerful noblemen, forcefully took women without their consent. The language here may even mean that the sons of God actually raped these women at will. In all events, the violence exemplified earlier in the exploits of Cain and his descendants reached another area of life, the violation of women. After Moses described the threat of the sons of God, he turned to his main concern, God's reaction to these events. We read these words in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3. My spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years. God grew tired of the ways sin continued to bring violence to the human race and declared that he would not tolerate this corruption forever. Nevertheless, God graciously determined to allow humanity another 120 years before executing his judgment. A second set of actions on earth and divine reaction appears in Genesis chapter 6 verses 4 through 7, the account of the Nephilim. In verse 4, we first read about another threatening circumstance that developed. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. Now, some older Bibles simply follow the Septuagint and translate the Hebrew word Nephilim as giants. But this translation is unfortunate because it does not convey the connotations of the word. Scholarly opinion is divided over the precise meaning of the term, but it is most likely that it refers to strong warriors or warlords. In this passage, Moses specifically described these Nephilim as heroes of old, men of renown. The term heroes, or ha-giborim in Hebrew, denotes warriors or powerful soldiers. In this context, the military notoriety of the Nephilim should be taken negatively. These men were known for their exploitative warfare and violence as they inflicted terror on those around them. The violence that began when Cain killed his brother Abel and continued in Cain's descendant Lamech had now reached even greater proportions as the Nephilim soldiers threatened violence at every turn. As we read in verse 5, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. With the appearance of the Nephilim, the corruption of the human race had grown to such proportions that sin utterly dominated humanity. And as a result, we read in verses 6 through 7 that the Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. So the Lord said, I will wipe mankind whom I have created from the face of the earth, men and animals, and creatures that move along the ground, and birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them. God saw how the Nephilim terrorized his world and determined that it was time to intervene with massive worldwide destruction. Happily, Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 8 do not end with words of judgment. Instead, in keeping with the overarching patterns of this portion of his primeval history, Moses added an afterword of hope in verse 8. There we read that even though God determined to destroy humanity because of the corruption of sin, there was one man who provided hope. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. In these few words, Moses completed the scenario of threat and hope of deliverance. The destruction of violent, sinful humanity through the flood would actually result in a deliverance for future generations. From our explorations of the literary structures of Genesis chapter 4 verse 1 through chapter 6 verse 8, we see that these chapters in Genesis focus on two major issues. First, they focus on the threat of violence from those who rebelled against God in the days of Cain and his descendants. Second, they focus on the threat of sinful people in the days of the sons of God and the Nephilim. In both cases, however, Moses indicated that God would bring deliverance through the one special son of Seth, the man named Noah.